The theme of this series of lightning talks is working in AI and the possible careers you could have in that space. I'm going to announce each speaker, and they're going to give a short talk. They're going to go sit back down, and then everyone will come back up at the end, and I'll ask questions. Okay, so our first speaker is Jan Leike. He is a PhD in reinforcement learning and a research scientist at DeepMind working on technical AI safety. So please welcome Jan.
Hey, thanks. All right, how do I build a career in technical AI safety? I'm going to start with a big spoiler, and my main point is basically it's the same thing as building a career in AI. So if you want to do AI safety, you should learn AI. But before I get into that, what does research on technical AI safety mean? Roughly, you can categorize AI safety into three categories of research. First, there's alignment research, which is basically about how do we build agents that we can teach arbitrary goals that end up doing what we want them to do. The second, and that includes things like semi-supervised reinforcement learning, reward hacking, safe exploration, and so on. The second part is about robustness, how we make sure that machine learning algorithms don't break unexpectedly, and includes things like machine learning security, interruptibility, robustness to distributional shift, and other things. And finally, the third category is about trust. How can we establish trust that we build the right systems? And that includes things like interpretability, how do I look into the black boxes and see what is going on there, and formal verification. And I should emphasize that this is kind of the machine learning perspective. And there's been other kind of research agendas around AI safety that have been raised, most notably the Asian Foundation's agenda advocated by Miri. But in this talk, I'm going to take the machine learning perspective. So what could technical AI safety research look like? This is an example of a recent collaboration between OpenAI and DeepMind. And this is a new technique to teach arbitrary goals to agents. And what we do is, so here, this is kind of a schematic of what the research, what the setup looks like. You usually have an RL algorithm interacting with the environment. So this is just normal reinforcement learning setup. And what we did is we put a new module here that is called the reward predictor, which learns a reward function. It learns to predict the reward for what the human wants. And the kind of important part of this is that it is to people who work in machine learning, this looks like normal machine learning research. And for us, it's motivated by long-term considerations of AI safety. So if you want to do this kind of research, it's amazing. We need a lot more people doing this stuff. There's currently a huge talent gap. So you might be asking yourself, how do I get there? So let's start with your undergraduate degree. What should you be focusing on? And ideally, your undergraduate degree should be in computer science or mathematics. You should learn all the regular basics like programming and algorithms, linear algebra, calculus, and so on. And then later on, you might focus more on machine learning and deep learning and reinforcement learning. And those are kind of the major core skill sets that at the moment are mostly in demand. There's some kind of important things I think to keep in mind. You should try to prioritize harder courses over easier ones. So if you want to have if there are math courses that you find interesting but they don't seem as related, still feel free to take them. You should, by the end of say your master's degree, you should try to aim to have some research experience by them, so you have better position to apply for PhD positions or similar. So you would want to start working with researchers early on. You want to get a paper published. And for that, it's usually advisable to find a supervisor who is good at supervising and not necessarily the most famous supervisor, because the most famous people usually don't have time to really supervise students. And the idea is that you should really try to find out early whether you're a good fit for this line of work, so that you can you know that this is worth pursuing this career path for you. Because if you go into a PhD, that's usually a many-year commitment. So that's the next stage. How do you get a PhD? I should emphasize that getting a PhD is usually the prerequisite for someone to hire you as a researcher, but it's not strictly required. So you could get away with having equivalent experience. But getting a PhD is usually like a one-stop shop package for all the relevant research skills that you need. That includes like coming up with ideas, knowing the literature very well, knowing all the basics, and being able to write and present your research results. I think an important point to make here is that you should not be afraid to work on regular machine learning research. There's like a mistake that I see every once in a while where people are really ambitious about doing AI safety research and they want to dive into AI safety research right away. But right now the field is in a stage where it's often not quite clear what good projects are. So you can get lost very easily. So usually I recommend to people to work on a project that your supervisor finds interesting, so you can get a lot of feedback from them. Ideally, like if you're doing your PhD, you just do normal machine learning research, but you're very interested in moving into AI safety after that. I think that's still a very good idea. There's also, if you have a master's degree, then you could do a PhD in Europe, which usually takes only 3 or 4 years, versus in the US, which can take over 5 years. And then you should, for PhDs in general, like there's lots of advice out there, like should you do a PhD, where should you do a PhD, what should you focus on? Should look at that. I think like right now the ideal background for doing AI safety research is a PhD in machine learning. And there's some alternatives to that. There's the brain residency, which is very competitive. You can do internships in various places. There's research engineering, where which is like a lot of people at OpenAI and DeepMind are doing. And this is basically working together with researchers on code, but more from an engineering perspective. And for that kind of work, you usually don't need a PhD. But yeah, so at the moment, PhDs in machine learning are extremely competitive. But if you can get into a program, I think it's very well worth it. And you're also like you will probably have very good exit strategies, because lots of people want to hire machine learning people right now. That's it. If you have questions, there is 2 excellent resources on the 80,000 hours page: the career review on machine learning PhDs and the AI safety syllabus. If you're interested in this sort of stuff, come talk to me afterwards. And once you get your PhD in machine learning, you should come work at DeepMind or OpenAI or other places. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Next, we have Miles Brundage speaking to us about careers in AI policy. Miles is a research fellow at Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute. His research focuses on AI policy and strategy, and recently he's been working on the relationship between AI and security, as well as thinking through how international agreements on AI might work. Welcome, Miles.
So I'm just going to say a few brief words about what AI policy is and what sorts of topics you would be working on and worrying about if you were to pursue a field in AI policy. And then Helen Toner is going to say a bit more about the institutional landscape and the more practical side. So to begin with, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about what AI policy means. It's sometimes conflated with sort of strict top-down regulatory bans on AI or something to that effect. But I define policy as just authoritative social decision-making about a certain topic or about a certain technology or issue. So AI policy is really just about what we as a society should do. And we doesn't just mean governments, but also corporations have policies towards AI in terms of what they publish and what the protocols are for privacy and so forth. Working on AI policy doesn't necessarily mean that you think we need, restrictive government regulations anytime soon or even ever. In the same way that someone who is, say, a left or a right-leaning healthcare policy analyst might conclude that the government should have a hands-off approach on healthcare policy. Rather, it's about asking the question of how we can ensure that AI has positive social consequences. There's a common distinction made in AI policy between short and long-term AI policy or AI policy issues, and I'll say something briefly about that because I think it's important to wrap your head around. So the way that I define long-term AI policy is worrying about the issues and trying to make progress on the issues related to AI that won't materialize for some time or will have very long-lasting consequences. And I think that maps on somewhat to the differences in focus between, say, organizations like the Future of Humanity Institute, which see themselves as doing long-term AI policy because we're concerned with AIs that have transformative economic and social consequences, whereas others who one might call doing short-term AI policy are focused on issues that we have right now. So accountability for algorithm-based decision-making and privacy issues related to the use of training data for AI. But I think this is also a somewhat misleading distinction because there's a lot of uncertainty about how quickly AI will develop. So some of the issues that we call long-term might actually arrive sooner than we think. So you might instead think of it as policies focused on current AI technologies and policies that are specifically, and policy analysis that's specifically about more transformative scenarios. There are already a lot of government policies that pertain indirectly to AI, even though there isn't, a Department of AI policy or anything like that in any government. And there are things like drone registrations and no-fly zones for drones that sometimes use AI. There are intellectual property laws that pertain to technologies in general and therefore AI. And there's a lot of government funding of AI research. But at the same time, there's still an awareness that something more serious and more sort of wide-ranging might be useful in the future. So for example, as was mentioned in my bio, one thing I'm interested in right now is whether international cooperation might be useful for dealing with some of the purported arms race situations that might already be arising or might arise in the long term as countries strive to use AI to pursue their military advantage. So I think it's not clear yet what the appropriate level of policy implementation or analysis is for AI, but I think there are a lot of potentially very thorny issues to think about. So just give a quick overview of some of the issues in this landscape. On the short-term front, there are issues of economic impacts of AI, though still smaller than one might see over the long term. There are issues around liability, bias, security, including automated defenses and attacks involving AI, as well as privacy. And I think these are all potentially very important issues in their own right. And I do think that from an EA perspective, you might want to be particularly focused on issues that will have very long-term impacts, such as those associated with general AI or superintelligence. But it's also the case that you can gain a lot of career capital by working on the short-term issues. And it might be that a lot of the same tools and institutions will be relevant to some of the short-term issues as well as the long-term issues. So, and I'm happy to talk more about that offline, but I think it's important to note that there might be synergies between different timeframes and different types of work. Over the long term, we might see scaled up versions of the sorts of issues that I just mentioned. So even more severe concerns around privacy, even more severe concerns about the economic impacts of AI. But there also might be some fundamentally new, or at least qualitatively differently large changes, such as big concerns around wealth distribution created by huge economic productivity gains from AI, or the risk of catastrophic misuse or catastrophic safety accidents. There could be concerns about even more extreme curtailment of privacy or freedom in a society where you could have nearly perfect surveillance as a result of automated infrastructure and drones and so forth. So I think there are very, very serious issues to think about in this area. It's not clear yet what the right solutions are, and I think that's why it would be good to have more people working in these areas. And I think we need to move from a general awareness of that there are all these problems and start thinking about what exactly can be done about them, if anything, and what the right level of governance should be, whether it's corporations or international bodies or national governments. There are lots of open questions, such as, how should we evaluate AI policies? So there's a paper, for example, by some of my colleagues at the Future of Humanity Institute called Policy Desiderata for the Development of Machine Superintelligence, which raises lots of issues around how we should think about justice and speed of transitions towards a more powerful AI. There are questions around the logistics of cooperating internationally. If nations were to agree that they don't want to just race to build the most powerful AI, but instead they want to cooperate in some fashion, how would you actually implement that? So I think there are interdisciplinary questions that involve the science of AI and thinking about the global distribution of software and hardware that also require policy analysis in various disciplines. So I think AI policy is an exciting area and one that requires a lot of different perspectives in order to make progress on. So with that, I will wrap up and look forward to any questions later on. Thanks.
Next, we have Helen Toner speaking about policy, funder, and strategy research careers in AI. Helen Toner is a senior research analyst at the Open Philanthropy Project, where she focuses on policy, governance, and strategy issues related to the progress in artificial intelligence. Before joining Open Philanthropy, she led EA Melbourne while studying chemical engineering and Arabic at the University of Melbourne. Please welcome Helen.
Great. So as Miles has said, there's a huge range of societal, strategic, policy, political issues relating to AI that are going to need a huge amount of work over the coming years. My guess is that navigating the effects of progress in AI, machine learning, robotics, automation is going to be the defining policy challenge of the coming decades. So now that Miles has laid out some of the topics that could be valuable to work on and are likely to need work over the coming years, I'm going to briefly touch on what kinds of institutions are out there where you might be able to do some of this type of work. And obviously there's a wide range of options here, so I'm going to kind of zoom over them at a high level rather than going in detail on any particular options. And actually one side note I'd make is that although there are a large number of kind of related fields where you might be able to do work on these kinds of issues, there really isn't an obvious home for work on AI policy and strategy in the same way that machine learning is a pretty obvious home for work on at least the machine learning angles of technical AI safety. And so what this means, and this is particularly true, I think, for the kinds of more transformative and longer-term issues that EAs tend to be more interested in. And so what this means is that if you want to work on these topics, on AI policy and strategy topics, you're going to need to be a bit more self-directed and a bit more entrepreneurial than you might need to be in other areas. So there aren't necessarily going to be existing courses of study or existing fellowships or journals or that kind of thing there for you. And you might need to be a bit more sort of self-directed and tread your own path in terms of choosing what topics you want to work on, persuading supervisors and superiors that what you're doing is interesting. Great, so with that intro out of the way, I'm going to break down the space into two main types of work you might do, which I'm going to call research and practice, and then split each of those into the kinds of institutions that might be good homes for each kind of work. So the first one, research. This is like going deep and doing original thinking on the kinds of questions that Miles was talking about. I think three key types of institutions where you might do this would be academia, think tanks, and EA organizations. So I'll go through one by one. So for academia, this likely looks like going to grad school, maybe doing a postdoc or a fellowship, maybe eventually going into more senior roles in a university. And academia is really well suited to choosing one specialized topic and going into a lot of depth on that topic. There's a lot of room for fundamental and theoretical research. And there's an ever-increasing number of interdisciplinary centers springing up at universities that could be good homes for this kind of work. So I'm thinking of places like the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford, the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity at Berkeley, Pulse at UCLA. There's a bunch of other centers like this. Or you could also go into a more traditional department like international relations or economics. And the best home for the work you want to do is just going to depend on what topics you're interested in and also which people you're working with and what they're interested in as well. Cool, so number two for research, think tanks. I think think tanks are fairly similar to academia in some ways in that they're relatively mainstream. They tend to have established areas that they focus on, established ways of doing things. And the key difference would just be that they are often more focused on concrete policy proposals and specific ways of implementing ideas rather than the kind of theoretical or fundamental research. So there's definitely some overlap between think tanks and academia. There are already some newer think tanks that are specifically focused on AI issues, and particularly on the kind of nearer term issues that Miles was talking about. So AI Now is one, and Data and Society is another. And you could also aim for a more established and kind of general purpose think tank as well, like the RAND Corporation, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Brookings, the Center for New American Security, just to name a few. There are lots. So that's think tanks. The third type of place you might want to do research would be at EA organizations, like the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, or the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge. And these places are going to be, really best if you want to be focusing on types of issues that EAs tend to care about disproportionately. So, again, these kind of longer term, more transformative scenarios. And I guess the trade-off that comes along with having the flexibility to work on these issues is going to be essentially that, these organizations don't yet seem to have as much connection to or recognition by political decision makers. So, I don't want to sell them short. There's certainly been some contact between FHI and the UK government, for example, and that's likely to continue. But I do think there is a bit of a trade-off there in terms of flexibility versus influence. Okay, so that is the research side of things. What I'm calling practice is roles that are more about, understanding what research is out there and putting it into practice, making decisions based on it for some given body. And I think there are two big categories of this type of role, probably government and government-ish organizations and industry. So to start with government, it seems very likely that the role of governments and government-like bodies is only going to increase in their role in the development and use of AI. And because of this, it would be really great to have more people from the effective altruism community working in governments. I think particularly in the US government, given how influential the US is on the international stage, but certainly also in other country governments, and also in multilateral organizations like the UN and others, which are starting to show some interest in AI issues, and I think that's likely to continue. So who should work in government? I think there's a unfortunately low number of effective altruists who seem to have an appropriate profile for roles in government. So I think if the description that I'm about to give sounds like you, I would really seriously consider it. So I think a good profile for someone to do well in a government role, I guess I'm thinking particularly about the federal government, but I think this applies to many types of roles, is someone who is well-rounded and generally capable. I think if you're a genius in any one given thing, you'll do better in that thing outside of government, most likely. But if you can do, a wide range, that might be good. You'll want to have decent interpersonal skills. I think particularly the kinds of interpersonal skills that will let you go into a meeting, with different people you don't know very well from different agencies with different goals, and, sound reasonable to them, get them on board behind the kinds of things that you're interested in. I think a couple of other important traits are to be really patient with bureaucracy. Unfortunately, I think that's going to be a key part of working in government. And then the last one is just going to be a citizen of whatever country you want to work in. So if you want to work in the US government, be a US citizen. In my case, that's an area for improvement. I think the second major category of practitioner type work would be working in industry. So this could mean working within AI organizations like DeepMind or OpenAI. Could also mean other industry organizations like the IEEE or the Partnership on AI. I don't think there are many positions like this available right now. DeepMind certainly has some policy staff, but I do think that the number of these types of positions is likely to increase. And this is likely to be, a less sort of stuffy and bureaucratic option where you're still close to the relevant decision makers. And I think, which of these, whether you're more interested in government type roles or industry roles, is also going to depend, of course, on how you expect the development of AI to play out and how influential you expect these different sectors to be. Okay, so to sum up, and again noting that this talk is simplifying a lot and aiming to skim over the landscape rather than cover anything in great detail, If you want to do research work, you might consider academia for in-depth or theoretical work, think tanks for more policy relevance, or EA organizations if you want to really stick to the topics that EAs tend to care about more than others. If you want to work as a practitioner, you could consider government if you have the patience for the bureaucracy, or otherwise there may also be roles in industry organizations that work for you, including in AI research groups. That's just about all that I have to say. If you're interested, you can check out the 80,000 Hours Careers Guide, which Miles wrote on these topics. I think if you Google 80,000 Hours AI Strategy, that should be the first result. And just before closing, I want to throw in one bonus angle, which is that China has been showing more and more interest and sophistication in AI and machine learning technologies. So I don't think this is for everyone, but in the spirit of taking a portfolio approach, if spending time in China and getting to know the scene there seems appealing to you, I would definitely consider that as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Helen. Next, we have Malo Bourgon and Andrew Snyder-Beatty tag teaming it to talk about careers in operations and management in AI. Malo is the Chief Operating Officer of the Machine Intelligence Research Institute. Malo oversees all day-to-day operations and program activities at MIRI. He also co-chairs the Committee on the Safety and Beneficence of Artificial General Intelligence and Artificial Superintelligence of the IEEE Global Initiative for Ethical Considerations in Artificial Intelligence and Autonomous Systems. Malo joined MIRI in 2012, shortly after completing a master's degree in engineering at the University of Guelph. Andrew Snyder-Beatty is the research director at the Future of Humanity Institute, University of Oxford. Before that, he worked as a project manager at the Future of Humanity Institute and as a researcher at MetaMed. His projects at FHI cover existential risk research, fundraising, recruitment, and outreach. While at FHI, Andrew obtained over £4.2 million from grant writing and wrote popular articles that received over 500,000 readers. His current interests include observation and selection effects, technological forecasting, and longer-term biosecurity issues. Please welcome Malo and Andrew.
So I think if I was to summarize the point in one sentence, it's just that operations is an incredibly important set of skills and career paths for people that want to have an impact at an EA organization. So that would be like the overall summary. I'll give a little bit background as kind of like my experience as a project manager at FHI. So I went into FHI as a project manager. There were a number of other project managers that have worked at FHI. And I think it's a tremendously high-impact career option for someone who cares a lot about the research, is really interested in the research, but also doesn't want to entirely specialize on the research and wants to also kind of integrate with the real world and like translate research into impact and do fundraising and interact with the world in these ways. So so three like kind of main areas as a project manager that I found super useful. So one obviously is fundraising. So if you're familiar with the research and you're a good writer and you enjoy writing grants, which is like relatively rare, you can have a tremendous impact. So a typical project manager at FHI raises something like $1 million in grant writing every year from non-EA sources. So these are like research council funding or various trusts and whatnot. And so even just from a purely fundraising standpoint, I would argue that project management within an EA organization could potentially be a superior option to earning to give if you're interested in these kind of issues. So that's like one kind of easily measurable way in which these careers have an impact. Another is just kind of outreach and ensuring that the research is having an impact in the real world. And this requires a very wide range of skills. So I think my favorite example of this was the Asilomar conference. This was after the publication of Superintelligence, and this was really kind of the first conference that got a lot of the stakeholders together to kind of create some common knowledge around why AI safety would be important in the future. And this took a tremendous amount of effort. This wasn't done at FHI, this was done at FLI, but basically all of the effort that went into that was an operations skill set effort. And I think that event really kind of got the ball rolling for the AI safety and AI strategy trajectory that we're on now, and was a tremendously important piece of work, potentially more important than all of the research that like any single piece of research that's happened recently. Other examples kind of within FHI include things like writing press releases and making sure that the right stakeholders have access to the research that one is producing, or interfacing with governments and kind of setting up collaborations. So recently we had a collaboration with the Finnish Foreign Ministry, who was kind of interested in some of these issues and setting that up. So that takes a lot of effort as well that isn't necessarily just on the research end.
One thing that I'll jump in there is I think on the communication side, there's also a very underappreciated skill of being able to both be interested and kind of deeply understand the work that people are doing, but also have the skill of being able to like very accurately model the different stakeholders and people that you're communicating with, because a lot of the topics that we're talking about have different audiences that have maybe different like pain points or concerns. And if you're kind of delivering this message that sometimes is a little complicated or hard to buy or whatever, there's like a very valuable skill of being able to kind of like create these models and speak to different audiences. And so if you feel like you have this writing skill or this communication skill and you feel like you're good at kind of knowing your audience and different people, like this is very high value. I think you could wander into basically any AI org who's doing like AI safety type of stuff. And even if they don't list a position, if you're this type of person and you hang out around there, you'll very quickly be someone who they want to kind of work with more. So yeah, please get in touch with any of us if that's a thing you have.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I guess the final thought is just kind of on the basic operations and management style roles that need to be filled within this space. So this is kind of like a really fundamental role, basically being the foundation on which things get done and on which an organization can rely on you to ensure that there's a platform on which the research and the outreach and all the impact can occur. And I think there's relatively few people within the EA community that have considered this as a longer-term career option, but I think a lot of people really ought to. So I think, well, I don't know, Malo, maybe you can say more about the impact of just, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So one thing I'll note kind of right out of the gate is oftentimes people who are good at this don't realize how like few people have kind of this skill. And so it seems obvious to them that this is like a very replaceable position, or, oh, you know, I can't do, you know, direct policy work or AI technical safety work, and so I guess I can go earn to give or use my skills elsewhere, and see this kind of like ops role as something that's very replaceable and kind of a little bit second tier, and I think that's like very wrong. And that even from my own experience, basically everyone I know who's good at this role kind of doesn't understand why other people think it's special. And so if you think you have this thing, like you are special, and orgs like FHI and Miri and other places need your kind of help. And the other thing I kind of want to emphasize is that there are a lot of like interesting opportunities for advancement in these types of roles. So even if like the initial role is something where it's very much like you're the person who's making things happen and you're not making decisions and managing people, if you have an interest in these subjects, and as you're working at these organizations, you're developing more of a specialization through interacting with everybody, and you have the ability of getting things done and moving projects forward, there will be lots of opportunities, especially in the smaller organizations, for someone who's a good generalist in that way to take on more responsibility, you know, go into management, that sort of thing. I mean, in kind of Miri's particular case, we have this thing where we're always trying to eat our superior's job. And so I'm always trying to steal all the things I can from Nate. Our office manager is trying to always take all of my job. And so I would, yeah, encourage people who think they have this skill to jump in on kind of intro roles and kind of build their capital that way. And there are actually a lot of opportunities right now in this space, and maybe Andrew can talk a little bit about some of the openings that FHI is going to have or has already.
Yeah, so FHI is going to be hiring for 2, maybe 3 operations roles in the very near future. The OpenPhil is also, I gather, hiring for a director of operations. So there are a number of positions already within this space that you know, we're searching for really top-notch people, like kind of elite operators. And so I will be doing office hours at 2 o'clock, along with Carrick and Neil and some other FHI people. So if you're interested in a role like this, please come get in touch. I'd love to chat more.
Yeah, and I'll say generally as well, if this is the type of thing you're interested in and you want more tips and thoughts on how to kind of make your way in, feel free to catch me around the conference.
The speakers could come up and sit for a few questions. Thank you all. So let's start with a question for Jan. For those of us who have already completed an undergraduate and perhaps graduate degree in something other than CS or mathematics, how do we gain the technical expertise to do AI technical safety research?
Yeah, that's a good question. Generally, so there's things you can. So the first step would just be reading up on literature, right? There's the AI safety syllabus, which is again really just an AI syllabus and has like lots of textbooks that you can look at. Usually, in order for someone to hire you a researcher in machine learning, if you have a PhD in a related field, is that you demonstrate that you can do research in this space. And like one idea would be that you do an internship in a place like Mila, and then try to get a paper published in machine learning, and that then you can point to the fact that you can do this kind of research. There's other avenues as well that you can take to gain this kind of skills, like for example, the bane resistancy and other things.
So we have a question for the policy people, Helen and Miles. What are the best places to get a graduate degree at which universities for people who want to influence AI policy?
Yeah, so I think in general, any top university is like any university with a good reputation is going to be a good place to start. The area that I can speak to best on this question is national security or security studies, and I think their SICE, so the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and Georgetown, which are both in DC, have really strong reputations there. Yeah, my impression is that any top school is going to put you in good standing, and maybe some of them have, slightly more or less established programs for different areas. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I would add, in addition to schools that are top, across the board, like Stanford and Harvard and others. So, like at Harvard's Kennedy School would be an example, but also places where there's an especially strong program in policy. So, like Tufts Fletcher's School or something like that. And I would also add that to some extent the school is not the only question. It might be the most important question, but it might also not be the most important question. It also matters that you're involved with a productive research group and have a good advisor who is interested in the sorts of issues that you're interested in and can provide good guidance. So I think that's another factor to consider.
Just adding that FHI might. So we recently have Alan Dafoe, who's come to FHI. And he's also considering building out a team of PhD students at Oxford. So that would be a good opportunity, like if you're interested in kind of advancing, doing a PhD like within kind of an EA org. This is something that we're trying to get a pipeline started for. So that would be kind of an exciting opportunity for some people.
Question number, the next question is there a place for philosophers of mind in technical safety research like DeepMind, or are they better off doing policy type stuff?
I guess it depends on like your exact background, right? So usually in technical AI safety, we do technical research, so you'd have to have a technical skill set to do this kind of research. I guess if you have like, if your background is like solely in philosophy, I would guess you're better placed in like a policy or strategy position. But again, depends on.
Yeah, and I would just add a general comment on like the value of philosophy. I think it's a very important skill set, and a lot of people who have done pioneering work on AI policy and strategy, like Nick Bostrom and Toby Ord, have training in philosophy. So But I think there's a need for those with that skill set and who are in a program in that area to sort of focus on the sorts of questions that are policy relevant. So, for example, I could imagine a lot of philosophy of mind or ethics to not be super relevant to, say, the design of AI systems, but I could imagine very fruitful research that looks at the specific questions of, machine, the moral patiency and moral agency of the sorts of AI systems that are being developed or will soon be developed, as opposed to sort of abstract analysis of, the space of possible minds.
Okay, thanks. Next question. What are the AI-related career opportunities for people who are unable to get a PhD for whatever reason?
I mean, I think most of the positions that Andrew and I spoke about lend themselves well to people who don't have PhDs. There's, a wide spectrum of kind of just making things happen at an organization where kind of very little specialization in anything is necessarily required if you have the right abilities, up to writing grants where kind of a lot more domain knowledge is important. But again, it's the type of thing that you can kind of pick up through interaction with the space and working at an org and developing those skills to the point where you can kind of take on those kinds of responsibilities. I guess another thing I'll say is at MIRI, credentials for researchers aren't as important if you can do the type of very big picture kind of mix of math and philosophy research that we're doing. And you kind of have the skill set for that, whether you have an undergraduate degree or a PhD. That's not particularly interesting to us. It's whether you have the skills. And so if you're in that direction, you should feel free to get in touch.
Yeah, and I'd add that in the policy and strategy space, I think a PhD is not super necessary. There are a bunch of graduate, so master's programs in things like international relations or MPP, Master of Public Policy, that are great options and will set you up pretty well even for the more mainstream, sort of think tank, government type things, especially if you can get internships while you're doing them. And again, echoing Malo, I think if you're aiming to work in EA organizations, there it's even less important. And if having some good work sample and showing that you can write about these issues is going to be more important than credentials for those organizations.
So a question for the policy people. Can you talk about the benefits and costs of pursuing a law degree in order to work on AI policy issues versus the other sorts of things Helen was mentioning?
So I think the benefits are, somewhat analogous to philosophy. It's sort of a disciplined way of thinking and analyzing, institutions and laws. And I think there's also a lot of subject knowledge that that could be useful in terms of understanding, what sorts of, legal apparatus are relevant to the development of AI, or what a fruitful legal policy would look like, and actually analyzing particular legislative proposals. In terms of costs, there are always opportunity costs with any discipline, and I agree with what Helen said earlier, that there's not any one disciplinary home of AI policy. So, the opportunity cost would just be like learning more, developing other skill sets like, game theory in an economics program or whatever. So I think, there are lots of ways, there are lots of disciplinary contributions to be made, and different degrees that could be useful.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I'd also just add that if you're particularly interested in going into specifically government, I think another benefit of law degrees is that they're generally pretty well looked upon in sort of a wide range of government roles.
Right. Any recommendations for AI-related work for those with an interest in reducing far future suffering in particular, as opposed to existential risk?
I don't know if they have any open positions, but FRI is definitely kind of like the main place that's thinking about those sorts of things. Oftentimes with small EA orgs, many people who get positions there aren't people who applied for a general posting, but if an opportunity presents itself or someone with a certain skill set, is in contact with the organization, that might be enough. So if that's a subject that you're interested in, I would definitely recommend getting in touch with those folks and seeing whether there's some fit there.
I also think there's a good argument to be made that working in kind of any EA organization is a good fit for someone with those interests. Unless you want to be specifically and only working on those things where something like FRI might be a better fit.
I just briefly add that in the same way that some of the same concepts and tools and issues are relevant over the short and long term, it might also be the case that some of the same policy concepts are relevant to addressing particular risks over the long term. So if you're able to make international coordination work to prevent automated hacking or whatever, then you might also be in a better position to prevent future suffering. So I think both FRI and also potentially other EA organizations could be good for that.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes left, so we're going to do 2 more questions. The first one for Jan. What's the difference in the work that research engineers and research scientists do at DeepMind? Could you say a bit more about the qualifications there, too?
Yeah, so usually the research engineers are more focused on engineering part of projects. So most of the work that goes on at DeepMind is very engineering focused, where we build new machine learning models, we implement new things, we try out new stuff, and that involves a lot of implementation necessarily. And research engineers are more focused on the implementation side of things. So usually you have teams of research engineers and researchers working together on a particular project, on a particular research project, and research scientists will focus more on the conceptual side and on figuring out the high-level goals of the project, and research engineers will work more on the implementation side. But that doesn't mean that research engineers are just coders. So a research engineer is expected to know machine learning pretty well and be able to read and write machine learning papers. But the qualifications for research scientists are usually more selective. So for a research engineer, you wouldn't be expected to have a PhD in machine learning. Usually a master's degree in computer science or maybe is sufficient. We also have research engineers from other disciplines who have done physics undergraduate degrees or other quantitative fields.
And finally, for the policy people, could you talk a bit more about if someone is trying to decide between academia versus advancing policy research directly in AI organizations, or EA organizations, excuse me, what sort of considerations might tip them one way or the other?
I think it really depends on what sorts of issues you're concerned about and what sort of work you want to do. So I think there tends to be a greater orientation towards temporary or contemporary issues at AI research organizations because they have fires to put out and current issues like privacy and so forth to worry about, and they have to worry about the particular concerns of the organization. If you want to take a more sort of a global scale perspective, then it might be better to not be tied to a particular organization. But I think there are pros and cons of both, and there isn't a clear choice between them. Even if you just want to do the research, so there are people who focus on research at AI research at AI organizations, and I think it also can be very helpful to be close to the research and to know what the actual technology is capable of. But it also to some extent is sort of a false choice because one can be in close collaboration with AI research organizations from the outside and vice versa.
Excuse me, I might have misspoke. I meant effective altruist organizations such as FHI or Open Philanthropy Project or whatever, as opposed to academia.
As opposed to academia. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so I think, again, I think it's somewhat of a false choice in that there are people at FHI who are in the process of getting their PhDs or DPhils, and it's housed at a university. But generally speaking, academics tend EA organization academics tend to be focused more on their disciplinary skill set and getting really high competence in a particular in a particular skill, whereas at an EA organization it'll be more interdisciplinary and drawing on a bunch of different perspectives. So you might lend itself to more general analysis. They're drawing on particular disciplines. So if you want to get a really strong foundation in a particular area, then you might want to go to the best poli-sci program or the best computer science program.
Yeah, I think I just add that probably the best thing to do is to figure out which specific topics you're interested in, and then figure out who you think is doing the best work on that. And so that could be, it could be an academic institution or could be an EA EA organization, or it could be somewhere like FHI that's both.
Thank you so much, everybody. Please give everyone.